My name is Alan Adams. I'm an editor with the Business Newsletter, Research Recommendations, and a member of the club and the Newsmakers Committee. Our newsmaker this morning, Patrick Lekota, you may have seen him on McNear Lara last night. I did, and he had some very interesting things to say about Nelson Mandela and about the situation. Mr. Lekota himself was in prison for 6 years and released just in December of '89. He had spent, he'd been in prison in the 70s when he knew Mr. Mandela, and has a great deal, obviously, of things to tell us. I think I'll let you do the rest, but we are certainly delighted to have you.
Thank you.
We will, he'll speak for 10 or 15 minutes, I think, and then we'll have questions and answers.
Perhaps I should just give a bit more meat to the point which has just been made. My own political career really began with work in the South African Students' Organization, SASO, and which I served as permanent organizer until September 1974, when I was detained under the then Terrorism Act. That was September 74, and I remained in detention until the end of January 1975, when I was charged. The trial ran between that time and the end of 1976, and then I was sentenced to a 10-year prison term, but 4 years of which I had to run concurrent with the rest of the sentence. So I did time on Robben Island between 1976 and 1982. And I was released in 1983. I became part of the contingent of political activists who set up the United Democratic Front in August of 1983. And I served as National Publicity Secretary until 1985, when I was arrested again and charged with high treason. And that trial ran again for a number of years until the end of 1988, when I was sentenced together with others to a period of 12 years. But then we took the matter on appeal, and the judgment was overturned by the Appellate Division on the 15th of December last year. That's when I left prison. If there is any interest, I may answer some questions, but the important thing I think for me at the moment is to talk more about the situation at home and how we see the situation unfolding. The release of Nelson Mandela has really transformed the situation at home, and the tide of hope for a settlement for our country has gone up, and we expect that we should be able to get the government to a conference table to discuss the future of the country within a short space of time. Of course, the government has to fulfill a number of conditions. Largely, the release of our comrades who remain in prison on Robben Island, in the Pretoria prison, in the capital, and in a number of the other prisons around the country. And of course, we expect that the government will grant immunity to those who have been exiled, so that they could also participate in the process inside the country. Then there is the fact that we would like to see the government lift in the state of emergency, so that there could be free political participation, public meetings, and consultations between the organization and the masses of the people on the ground. That clearly shows that it's a bit of a distance that still has to be traveled before we can get to the conference table. And part of my presence here, of course, is to urge opinion both in the government and outside government, that pressure should be kept on the South African government to fulfill these conditions which I've just mentioned, and in that way to hasten the beginning of the process of negotiation for a democratic constitution. I have been able already to meet a number of people in the administration, and I will be meeting others as well in the course of today and tomorrow. And I will proceed from New York, where again I will have consultations with a number of other people in the United Nations and various missions to carry forward this message. Additional to this, of course, is that we are beginning to to prepare the ground for bringing Comrade Mandela out to this country. It is important for us to take a decision on this and also to plan how we will run the tour when he does come out here. I think perhaps I should hold it there and then see if maybe there are any specific areas that you are particularly interested in.
I wonder if you could, I'm Bill Graham of the Las Vegas Business Press.
Yes.
Of course, my readers are interested in the economy of South Africa after apartheid has ended. And Mr. Mandela has made several different comments about the economy. In some places he's quoted as favoring nationalization. Is there a role for U.S. companies to invest in South Africa, particularly oil companies?
Yes, there is certainly a role that American companies can play in our economy, and we do hope that as soon as the situation is normalized at home, we will be able to invite American companies to invest in our economy. At the moment, we are insisting on the maintenance of sanctions because we think that a relaxation of sanctions at this stage may well encourage the government to drag its feet and not move towards a negotiated settlement. But we are doing that conscious of the fact that we also have an obligation to preserve intact the economy of the country, because our own freedom will yield more to our people if we inherit a strong economy. Yes, the phrase or the concept of nationalization has been raised, and it is correct that in terms of the Freedom Charter, which is the policy document of the movement, we intend to nationalize monopoly sectors of the economy, mining and banking. Now, this naturally conjures the idea of socialism and so on and so on. But we consider that nationalization does not equal socialism, to start with. Secondly, we have made plain that other than the monopoly sectors of the economy, the rest of our economy will remain free enterprise. And as a matter of fact, and although people are alarmed by us talking about nationalization, major sectors of South African economy, in fact, have always been nationalized in the sense that the state has always had a major share in them. If you take the Iron and Steel Corporation, it's always been state-owned. If you look at the South African Airways, you look at the railways and so on, they've always been nationalized, and the economy has been developing in spite of that. Now, it does appear that now when we say, however, that we will nationalize sectors of the economy, it looks like we are saying we're going to do something that's not been done. It's been part and parcel of the economy of South Africa up to now. And it's only that we are going to add certain sectors to that process. But it is not something new in South African economy that we will be doing.
How does education and housing fit into that whole picture of nationalization?
You see, the major reason why we intend to nationalize some of the sectors of the economy is that because of the disparities of apartheid has created in the past, we need to be able to divert part of the wealth of the country towards upliftment of those communities which have been disadvantaged. And the areas which you mentioned are particularly sensitive and relate closely to this matter. First of all, up to this point in time, black people, particularly African people, may not own land in South Africa on 87% of the surface of the country. And this accounts for the fact that Africans virtually have no homes in that country. There is, of course, large squatter settlements at the moment. Part of the reform process that the new government will have to take into account is to obtain land and make it available for black housing. And that means, of course, the government will have to obtain this land, and clearly those who've been occupying that land, who've been owning it, will have to be compensated. There's a huge amount of capital will be needed to obtain that land. And we consider that the nationalization of some of the sectors of the economy will make it possible for the government to obtain the necessary capital that can then be channeled towards purposes such as those. I think it is in fact no exaggeration to say that there is no education for blacks in South Africa at the moment. In 1953, Dr. Verwoerd, who was then Minister for Native Affairs, introduced an act of parliament. It was then called Bantu Education Act. Effectively, it took Africans away from the main education body and set them aside, prescribed a particular type of education for them, which is, in fact, it's not even worth being called education. It's a kind of thing that has reduced Africans. Really, we were just being taught in terms of that system to be able to hear the orders which are issued by the bosses and to do some menial jobs. Which explains why, when people say that the American companies benefit blacks in South Africa and that we will lose jobs, are actually talking nonsense, because we have no education, and because we have no education and proper training, we can't perform meaningful jobs in mobile, for instance, in IBM, and so on. We simply can't take advantage of the jobs which are offered by Polaroid or any of the American companies operating in our country. We don't have the qualifications to do those jobs. Now, the people who benefit from that, from the presence of these companies, the people who are properly trained, who are competent, are white South Africans who get the kind of education that is proper education that prepares them to use those jobs. As a result, it is really white South Africa that benefit by way of those companies being there. All that Africans do is to work as guards at the gates, security guards, to sweep the floors of the buildings, and that to be messengers and so on. The kind of menial jobs which in any event, are meaningless. Even when you look at the wage scales of these multinationals, you will see that the vast bulk of the benefits of the money, for instance, which they pay out, is paid to white South Africa and not to blacks. The only way in which that situation can be corrected is that the government must be pressured to a situation in which a new government can be set up in the country that can then integrate education, or at least introduce a kind of education system which will also prepare Africans for meaningful participation in the economy of the country. And then, of course, we can begin to take advantage of those things. Once more, setting up, and revamping that education will need a lot of capital. The schools have been, you will have seen in the last years, in the rioting that took place and so on, one of the targets of black anger has been the schools. the buildings burned down and so on and whatnot. The reason is simply that, not because we don't want education, not that our people don't want to be prepared, but people go and sit in the classes and get junk the whole day and so on. And even kids of 15, 16 can just sense that there is no benefit for them. They don't learn anything. And so we are going to need to build large amounts of education institutions, push Africans into this. Tertiary education, we need additional structures set up, manpower that's going to pilot and push fast, education programs and training for black people. All that means, first of all, we've got to have the capital by which we are going to set up those things. We've got to get the capital by which we are going to be able to attract qualified people who can come into the country and assist to train our people. Unless we nationalize and therefore we have the necessary capital, we can't see how we are going to do it.
What sources, who are you looking for? Looking to obtain these sources of capital? Any specific countries or companies or whatever?
I'm sure we will be looking to various countries, naturally. I mean, apart from the capital that we will generate from our own economy, we will need to seek support from friendly countries. And I mean, countries like Great Britain, with which we have long historical ties, will be tapped. Governments as the United States, I mean, the countries such as the United States, with which also we have a considerable amount of historical linkage by way of so many of our people have been trained here. And in any event, with American companies which have also been part of our economy, particularly since the Second World War, large numbers, we will need to tap sources of support from areas such as those.
What is the future now of the UDF? Do you see it becoming part of the ANC in a formal way now that the ANC is legalized? And what kind of time frame do you see for any sort of amalgamation?
Yes, you see, I think in a very short space of time that there will be. I think there will be an amalgamation. In fact, I shouldn't say that there will be an amalgamation. I think we will formalize the amalgamation, because in any event, the United Democratic Front has been the non-violent or the unarmed section of the movement which has been advancing the Freedom Charter as an alternative inside the country. So it's really just a matter of, I think, formalizing it. The matter is being discussed, and in April of this year we will have a National General Council, and I think a final decision will be taken by the movement at that stage.
I wanted to ask you about Mrs. Thatcher talked about lifting sanctions. Is that what do you think of that?
Well, Mrs. Thatcher has never been popular with us, and because she's always seemed to be keen to protect the regime at home. She's always leaned towards supporting the government. And we are not shocked that she has called for an immediate uplifting of sanctions. She's never in any event supported sanctions. So it's a position that she's always occupied, but it's nonsensical in our judgment. Because as the speech of President Elect so clearly showed, the pressures of economic boycott of South Africa went a long way towards pressuring the government to take the kind of steps that it is taking at the moment. Yes.
The problems that you have to get negotiations going, the government at this point seems to be intransigent, might not be the right word, but they don't seem to be moving towards meeting the requirements for getting negotiations going. What is it going to take to try and get the government to drop the state of emergency and the other conditions that you required that you mentioned earlier?
Well, increased pressure. The reason why we've been saying that sanctions must be kept in place and that pressure must be kept on the government is because we realize that unless that pressure is kept, they will not move forward. Inside the country, we have our own plan to keep up the pressure. And we've been running a defiance campaign since last year. We intend to intensify it this year. And I'll give you an idea as to how we propose to go about it. In recent times, you will have seen from the reports which come from South Africa that we blacks are for the first time now officially allowed to swim in the same waters as our white compatriots, and that we may use the same toilet and so on. The government is in fact indicated that it will repeal the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act, which was the act really primarily behind this kind of thing. This, of course, has given the impression to people that apartheid is all done and finished in the country. Now, we intend to take up the defiance campaign, to take an angle with the defiance campaign at this stage that will actually educate international opinion about just how lively apartheid is in our country, and this is how it is. We will target a number of laws which make up apartheid. The first will be the 1913 Land Act and the 1936 Land and Trust Act. Those are the acts which deny us the right to obtain land in the country wherever we want to obtain it. Then there is the Population Registration Act, which is the act by which immediately one is born, you have to register that I have been born, and then you are registered racially, and then that determines the path which you will travel throughout your life until it all even decides what graveyard you are going to be buried in. Then there is the Education Act, you see, which we intend to keep pressure on the education front to show, to reveal and expose the fact that this remains alive. And we will target laws such as the Group Areas Act, which is an act that makes it impossible for us to obtain housing wherever we may want to obtain housing. In terms of the provisions of the Group Areas Act, there are areas which are supposed to be for white only, and even if there may be housing that's standing there, and by the last count, there were some 30,000 housing units which were standing empty. And although there's such a high shortage of housing in black communities, blacks could not move to occupy those housing units simply because they were in the areas which are supposed to be for whites. So what we will do is to defy some of these laws, target areas, get people to go and occupy those housing units, and accept imprisonment if it becomes necessary. But at the same time, we are satisfied that that will reveal to the international community the fact that apartheid remains alive. In relation to the question of the Land Act, we'll identify land which is actually government land and move communities to occupy it, in defiance of the law. And then, of course, in this way, we expect that we will not only be placing pressure on the government, but at the same time that we will be educating the international community about just how deep-seated apartheid is within our society.
Yeah.
Well, okay, let me give you a chance.
I wanted to know if there have been any talks between UDF and Inkatha, and if so, what could you update us, and if not, any planned?
Yes. There have been peace talks going on intermittently, really, between the UDF and more specifically Chief Buthelezi, because he's the person who's supposed to be at the head of Inkatha. But those peace talks have not been productive, largely because Chief Buthelezi is not really interested in the situation of calm and peace obtaining in Natal. It is in the interest of Inkatha, as a matter of fact, that the kind of situation that is going on in Natal must continue as it's doing. The last time the matter was picked up, we decided that there had to be a meeting between the United Democratic Front and COSATU on the one side, Inkatha, and then, of course, the African National Congress. It had ultimately been agreed that we would have to meet somewhere outside the country because at that time the ANC was still illegal inside the country. Then Chief Buthelezi raised a lot of problems about the venue. First, he would not meet us in Africa because he said that Africa was a hunting ground of the African National Congress and he and his people would not feel comfortable there. Then we put forward a proposal that we could meet in one of the Scandinavian countries. Again, he was not happy with that. Finally, he seemed to suggest that we should go to London, and when we thought that we would be going there because we were willing to meet him anywhere he was interested in, he shifted ground and seemed to be talking about finding a place somewhere in Africa, and at that time he seemed to be saying proposing that perhaps we could go to Botswana. But all the time that is happening, time was getting lost. And there was problems which are taking place in the country, and we felt that now we had to find a different way of sorting things out. One of the things that we are doing at the moment is to actually visit conflict areas and talk to communities there, just like to bypass him, and simply go straight to the people and talk to them. We are beginning to make progress in that direction. And I may mention to you that although he receives a lot of publicity and the impression is created that he is a very powerful politician, that we have in fact begun to kill him politically, that is to say, because a lot of support is coming over to our side and he is losing a lot of support. I'm not saying that because I am a member of the United Democratic Front. Only 2 to 3 weeks ago, Tongaat Hewlett, which is a giant magnate sugar producing company, and which has generally been very close to Buthelezi over the years, hosted a dinner at which they invited one of the University of Natal academics to talk to them on the situation in Natal. And one significant point he made, for the first time, an academic from the ranks of those who really support him stated publicly that Inkatha is losing support at an incredible rate and that it is only a matter of time before it is a thing of the past. So prospects of peace and calm in Natal are very high.
Yeah, well, Nelson Mandela reserved the right for the ANC to use violence. Everything that you've described this morning in strategy is a nonviolent strategy. Do you think that is going to be adequate to achieve the goals of UDF and ANC?
And the position of the movement is that it will not dismantle its army before it is satisfied that there will be no need for Umkhonto Wesizwe, that the spear of the nation. You will remember that Nelson has been pressured by the government in the past to renounce violence, but then he refused. No thanks. The position is this. Armed struggle in our struggle, armed tactics in our struggle have always been a tactic that belonged to a time period, was adopted at a given point, and was never a principle. When ground opens, by which we could intensify pressure on the government, or if we feel satisfied that we can maintain sufficient pressure on the government by way of nonviolent mass action, we will emphasize that. I think you will have noticed that, as a matter of fact, there has been a tapering down of our actions of sabotage and attacks of that nature. The reason is simply that we would like, as much as possible, and the movement really is committed to resolving the issues in our country by political means. So, for the time being, for the foreseeable future, the movement has not yet reached the conclusion that it in fact can do without its army. So the army will remain perhaps as a semi-dormant weapon, but it will be there until such time that the movement is absolutely satisfied that it can do without it. It is impossible for me to say that we know that mass action alone will be enough. It is impossible to say that. Because as a matter of fact, it is impossible to say to what extent armed struggle contributed to advancing our struggle, and at the same time it is impossible to say to what extent mass action itself did that. There was a combination of factors in our situation. Each one of these factors played a role, but one can't say in terms of percentages which one was more crucial than the other.
At what point, though, does the movement make the decision to use the armed struggle, to become armed in response? Some of the strategies that you've outlined here this morning seem as though you're headed for direct confrontation with the defiance campaign. Do you envision any kind of use of force throughout that strategy?
No, our intention is that it must remain, it must not be, force should not be employed. That is our intention. But depending on how the state responds, because if the state responds by way of smashing people, shooting them down and so on, I'm sure that the army will now, the armed section of the movement, will automatically move of its own. I belong to the section of the movement that's always been operating on a nonviolent front. And I'm aware that on many occasions when we have piloted nonviolent campaigns and the government has shot down and arrested many of us, that has only had the effect of activating the armed section of the movement. And we can only hope that the government will continue to allow increasing space for nonviolent forms of action without repression. And of course, this again is the reason why it is important that the government, for instance, must lift the state of emergency. Because as long as the state of emergency remains in the country, there is no free political participation. And there's always a threat to people that if they may protest, they can easily be taken into prison. That is the reason why we are demanding that the government must do away with the Internal Security Act, under which people may be detained purely, as the government would say, to prevent them from committing crimes, when it actually means that they should be prevented from carrying on political action. That will be under Section 28 of the Internal Security Act. But now, over and above that, they also have now Section 29 of the Internal Security Act, under which one can be detained incommunicado, without access to lawyers, without access to family, for indefinitely.
Would it be fair to say that the sanctions are really your only tool of leverage?
This is absolutely incorrect.
Okay, well,
Yes, in fact, it is not even the cutting edge of our struggle. The cutting edge of our struggle is the kind of action, the mass action activities, in fact the activities which are being taken by us inside the country. That is really the cutting edge. All that the international community can do, and this is what we are asking, is just to give up backup action. When it comes to breaking the backbone of apartheid, that has to come, and it will be done by us. It can only be us who can do it inside the country.
Would you specifically denounce the practice of necklacing?
It has never been, necklacing was never the policy of the movement. It was never decided by the movement that we are going to necklace people. And therefore we have always made it quite plain that it had nothing to do with the policy of the movement. Necklacing resulted at a time when major sections of the leadership of the movement were drawn into jails, and masses of our people were left without leadership and therefore without actual direction as to what was to be done, when, and so on. So in that situation, in which, of course, the army was roaming the township, shooting down women and children and, just almost like anybody, people reacted of their own, spontaneously. This practice of we ourselves were shocked by what happened with necklacing. I remember the very first incident when we saw this thing, because we were already in jail, and there was a woman who was necklaced in Springs on the way to a funeral, because people discovered that she was in the midst, and at the same time that she was actually there as an informer, police informer. She was a pimp. And in the heat of the moment, and because of what was happening to those who were being arrested by the police, because pimps give information to the police, people get arrested and they get tortured. That's how people like Steve Biko died. And it was this kind of experiences which our people had had, that when they discovered people such as an informer in their midst, reacted on the spur of the moment and burned people. But the policy, I mean, necklacing has never been the policy of the movement.
I heard you mention the UDC, UDF, the ANC, and Inkatha.
Yeah.
Could you talk about what are some of the major political and community action groups and their relative size and strength inside South Africa?
Strength and size. Well, the ANC, UDF, COSATU alliance is by far the biggest grouping. In fact, I should put it this way, that the movement behind the Freedom Charter, you see, is immediately the biggest all around the country. I mean, it will control support in every region of South Africa, in the Orange Free State, in the Transvaal, in the Cape, in Natal, even in the homelands. Then there is, specifically now in relation to black communities, then there will be, I think next in line will be the PAC, which has got a pocket of support around Johannesburg, and a pocket of support in the Eastern Cape, and a pocket of support in the Western Cape.
How large, I've never heard the Pan-African Congress mentioned in these ladies' discussion. How large is that pocket of support that you have?
It's just very small, really insignificant. Really insignificant. I must just say, I'm not saying so because I don't support the PAC, but it's absolutely insignificant. It's fair to say to you. It's not only it's insignificant for various reasons. I could explain really why it is like that, because the PAC has no leadership and the PAC has not been seen by the masses of our people in the country to be doing anything against the government. Although it's supposed to have committed itself to armed struggle, for instance, I can quote one incident in which any of the PAC people engaged the government in recent times. There has also been very erratic positions taken by the leadership of the PAC, which I think in the judgment of the people at home has discredited it. In '59, when the PAC was formed, they said to people, and they made a big offer. They said that the ANC had not brought freedom since it was set up in 1912. And they said, we will give you freedom by 1963. That was the offer, that was the promise that they made to the masses of people. And of course people, rushed into the PAC with this belief that by 63 the PAC would give them freedom. This is 1990. And you can imagine many of those who went to Sharpeville and who were shot and killed, some of them crippled and so on, when they're believing that freedom, the PAC would give them freedom by 63. And when that didn't come, when that promise was not fulfilled, the kind of disappointment, you see, and shock and disillusionment that it caused simply, discredited it in the eyes of the people. And this is now additional to that, of course. There was nothing that the PAC did in time. But in recent times, when Walter Sisulu and others were released, the leadership of the PAC lacked the statesmanship that could have won it admiration. We had, when Sisulu was released with others, Nelson had pleaded the case of all of those men, but in doing so he had also included a member of the PAC, Jeff Masemola. We would have thought that when therefore they were called, when a national rally was called to welcome these men who had given so much to the struggle, that the leading lights in the PAC would have joined the nation in acclaiming men who had done more than anybody in terms of keeping up the spirit of resistance. But the PAC leadership, in the person of Zaf Mutuping, for instance, did not have the magnanimity to come and join the nation and come and say, well done, and so on. And then again, you see, it's just done them down and so on. It's a lack of ability, a lack of leadership, lack of correct, steps, lack of statesmanship and the part of the PAC, look, if you take now the situation that is obtaining, we are saying that although the movement has been engaging in armed struggle and things like that, that any time when the government is ready to negotiate a settlement, we will avail ourselves of that opportunity if we are satisfied that the government is genuine about it. The PAC position is that they are not interested in negotiating. We've gone to the OAU and said, look, we ask you to support us. Here is the Harare Declaration. Support this demand. Let South Africa fulfill these conditions and we'll be ready to negotiate. The OAU supports our position, and we went to the non-aligned movement. They support our position. Then we went to the Commonwealth. They supported us. And then we came to the United Nations in New York, and again we got support there. People with now, who shares the position of the PAC? Not inside the country, we are satisfied that it is madness to say that people must just go on fighting for the sake of fighting. If there is an alternative, if we can find a political solution to the problem of our country, that has to be done, because armed struggle is not fought with pieces of wood, it is fought with lives. And the people in the country are disappointed, absolutely disappointed in the position that the PAC is taking, because what people are saying is that the PAC seem to be committed to playing with the lives of our children, because they are not availing themselves of this. So, I mean, people have got sense, you see, and it is this kind of things which have reduced it to nothing and continue to reduce it to nothing.
Mr. de Klerk takes the position, or just took the position, that there cannot be one person, one vote, that the votes of blacks should be diluted as opposed to the votes of whites. He restated that, I guess, last evening on ABC. Are you able to start negotiations even with him having that position, I would guess, that as a starting point? Is that would not be a bar?
Yeah, well, that's the issue that will be discussed. That will be discussed when the actual negotiations begin. But that is not one of the preconditions for negotiations.
Coming back to the preconditions, it sounds as though you're going to have to have. It's going to be quite some time until negotiations start, given the preconditions and given the movement that you said the work movement will have to do.
It can only take long if the international community supports the position of the National Party. If the international community, for instance, among others, does not keep up the pressure that we are saying should be kept up, but otherwise it should be short. It shouldn't be that long.
How can I follow up? Just follow up. When you say that long, can you quantify that in terms of time?
I would say in the next, through this year into next year, we should be able to get them where we want them to be.
That is, you would hope negotiations would begin by sometime in 92?
No, at least 91, at least.
At least 90.
91, at least 91, yes.
Are you satisfied with the recent statements that you heard coming from the Bush administration with respect to inviting Mr. Mandela here and Mr. de Klerk here to talk about the possible lifting of sanctions? How do you react to that?
No, we are really unhappy about the fact that President Bush has issued this invitation to de Klerk, because it's, at this stage, you see, it's like saying, well, we are now satisfied that you have done everything that you had to do, and we think that this is not the position. Secondly, we can't understand why the United States administration should treat Nelson on par with de Klerk. Nelson represents the movement for democracy in our country. De Klerk represents the reactionary oppressive regime that even at this stage continues to keep the country backward. We would have expected that the administration of the United States would lean towards the side of democracy, that they would invite Nelson here, and that they would make plain their bias towards the side which advances democracy. You see, we have been struggling to get white South Africans to accept us as partners in the government of the country since before 1910. And the fact that even at this stage we are saying to the world, look, if these chaps take satisfactory steps, we are prepared to join them in the search for a political solution. should really show just how magnanimous we are. We've suffered a lot under the government, and I think we deserve to get better treatment from the United States and other countries of the world. Nelson has just come out of prison at 27, in fact, onto his 28th year now. And now, the American administration wants to give him exactly the same treatment as it is given to de Klerk, who's been part and parcel of a government that has kept Nelson in jail over all of these years. And de Klerk himself has been part of Parliament since 1972. He's been part, and we have no record of de Klerk ever raising his voice to say that he thought it was wrong to keep Nelson in jail before now. It has only been pressure that has brought him to this. And yet, the American administration will want to place both men on par. We don't understand why this should be like this, and we find it unacceptable.
Wasn't it a recognition that he had freed Mandela? Isn't that why he was invited here to show, the steps that he took? Do you think that's worth noting?
Well, that is the thing again. You see, exactly to whom should credit for the release of Nelson go? Everybody is saying, no, we have to be thankful to de Klerk. Why should we be thankful to de Klerk? It has been our struggle. It has been our suffering. It has been our people dying in the prisons, in detention, at the hands of de Klerk's police, and so on and so on. We are the people who moved this man to this position. He is doing what he is doing, not because one day he woke up with a golden heart, but he is doing it precisely because of the pressure that we have been applying on the government. Really. It is the people of our country, the masses of men and women who are denied so many things and who've been denied so many things over time. They are the ones who should be patted on the back, who should be congratulated for Nelson's release. Nelson was not released by de Klerk. He was released by our people. It is us who released him. And when that interpretation, that angle is taken and that interpretation is taken, it is clear that there is nothing to be thankful for to de Klerk. Well, of course, we may make a difference and say, there is only this difference, that de Klerk has begun, at least responded sensibly to the pressure that we were applying on him. Not that of his own, he just started off and decided, okay, I'm going to release him and so on. Because this angle that is being taken suggests that kind of thing, and it's unacceptable to us.
The American press, the world press is acting as if this thing just happened. Well, it did. Nelson just coming out. But could you talk a little bit about the elections in September? Was not the groundwork and the framework laid out for this with the National Party and the quote-unquote current electorate?
You mean, was there not an agreement made at that time? Is that what you're
trying? He was going to let Mandela out back in September, did he not? In the September elections.
No, but that was not there was no such commitment made at that stage, or an agreement with the electorate that something of that nature had to be done and so on. In any event, even if de Klerk could have said to his electorate, I intend, you must elect me because I want to release Nelson when I do it. White South Africans are responding and they returned de Klerk there, because they had begun to feel the pinch of the pressures which we were applying on the government themselves. I mean, they couldn't, now it had become difficult for them even to go into stores to go and buy, because they went in there and they didn't know, none of us knew whether you would come out alive at the height of this thing. They couldn't go into trains. You got into a train at own risk. You see, there were all of those pressures, and above all, young white South Africans had to, mend the borders of the country, because the guerrilla armies were coming, the guerrillas were coming into the country, and many of them were spending years and years away from their families. They were becoming, life for them was just as good as it was for us, because we were being locked up and kept long periods away from our families and things like that in the prisons. But in order for us to be kept there, they had to live, also their family life had to collapse, they had to forget about their homes, and they had to be there and so on. It was when they began to feel those pressures, and particularly when their children and young men were dying on the borders and things like that, and even in the townships where they were going around with all the hippos and all the weapons and so on, that there too, some of them were losing their lives, that white South Africans began to question the situation and began to think now, how could they relieve themselves of the pressures which were there? And it is for this reason that we are saying that South Africa had become uncomfortable for all of us. And we made it uncomfortable for them. We had to make it uncomfortable because otherwise it had always been uncomfortable for us. And those kind of pressures are the ones which forced white South Africa to think anew. And then, of course, paths had to be sought, had to be found, and so on. And the de Klerks and things like that began to see that it would be necessary to do, at least to do something, to listen to what we are saying. See, although the old man, P.W. Botha, was still very stubborn. And differences began to develop inside the National Party. And that's how they came to kick him out as they did last year, because increasing opinion amongst themselves was that, look, we could only guarantee our future and our children's future if we begin to respond in different ways to the pressures which are being applied.
How would you characterize the support that you have amongst, any support that you have amongst white South Africans in the UDC? How many and how would you characterize?
Yes, our support, I mean, we have a fairly representative amount of support in the white community, but I must say that proportionately it's still very, very low. It is growing, of course, very fast at the moment.
One of the few countries that has been supportive of the white minority government has been Israel. Once the majority of South Africans take over, do you think that what's going to happen with the relationship between South Africa and Israel? And where does the ANC stand in its relationship to the Palestinians and the Israeli government?
Well, we will take, we take the position that our country, when it attains to independence, must set up a kind of government that will support the independence and the freedom of various peoples. And that includes, of course, the Palestinian struggle. We can't, having ourselves suffered under the kind of regime that South Africa has been, we can't support a regime which will deny a section of people that live under it full rights and the right to self-determination. I think that clearly there will be a qualitative change on the relationship between South Africa and Israel. And I think there will be more that will come from South Africa on the side of the oppressed people of Palestine. And we will join the international community and support generally moves towards the correction of the situation there.
I wonder if we could take one more question. We've closed the press conference at 10 o'clock. Well, you can continue afterwards, obviously.
I haven't had a chance to ask a question. Yes. Can you please tell us a little more about the meetings you've had with officials here?
Excuse me?
The meetings that you've had with officials here. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so far I have met Ambassador Perkins.
Ambassador?
Perkins, yes. Now, Ed Perkins was ambassador to South Africa during the last 5 years or so, I think. 4 years or so, I think. And although there was a lot of opposition to his initially to his appointment, but he did play a very constructive role, particularly in the last year or so of his stay there. So I have had part of my seeing him was really to pass our vote of thanks to him on the kind of support which he offered us. Our struggle at home in the days that he was there. And I conveyed to him naturally our expectations for the future from the American administration. I hope that will help clarify things to people in the Department of State. And then I also had audience with some of the Africa staffers and generally discussed our strategy as we anticipate is going to unfold. Yesterday I had an audience with Cohen.
Cohen, right.
Yes. Is
Undersecretary of State for Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs.
That's correct. Yes, and his deputy, Warren Clark, and some of the other people. Generally, again, the issue was that did, of course, attempt to persuade them, particularly on the issue of sanctions, because Under Secretary Cohen has been making rather uncomfortable noises about lifting the sanctions and so on. Attempted to put across our own point of view and actually show that it was still too early to think along those lines and to initiate that kind of moves.
In that regard, do you think you had any persuasion with him about the sanctions, or do you expect the U.S. to lift the sanctions?
I think I was able to convey to him, I think, something of which I believe must force him to be a bit wary before he pushes for the lifting of the sanctions.
I am sorry, it is 10 o'clock and Mr. Lekota has an appointment on the Hill. So we thank you for coming, and if you do have time for some other conversations, of course, you may continue, but we'll end the press conference here.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much.
When did you come to the United States?
That concludes the Newsmaker address from today. Be sure to join us Friday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, when our call-in program will focus on inter-American affairs and will feature representatives from the Organization of American States. In just a moment, a look at campaign financing.